everybody for coming, and thanks especially to Mary for having me such a wonderful host. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Just a couple of prefatory remarks then. Mary invited me to speak specifically on queer issues, and it was just so wonderful to sit down and think about that and realize how often I sort of background that a little bit in my work and in some of my talks. So thank you for that. And also, I just want to say that my work is concerned primarily in cancer in the United States, and there's overlap to be sure with Canada. I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards. But it's true that the United States, as you all know, has a distinct and somewhat bizarre system of health and other cultural practices. So, is this a recorder? Okay. So when I first started thinking about the talk, I thought about trying to offer a comparison between the United States and Canada, but I realized that actually my work is on the United States, and it's based on a kind of cultural, historical, and medical analysis, as well as interviews with patients, doctors, and activists primarily in the United States. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. And I actually think that what happens in the U.S. also affects in terms of how cancer is lived and also how research is done, cancer in Canada. And in other parts of my book, I argue that this is so even at the level at which chemicals are pumped into people. And so I think it's really critical to try and work that out. And that's the political impetus of this work. So I don't really blame people for not knowing how to engage with a person with cancer. How would the heck? I hadn't either, despite the fact that each year 70,000 Americans between the ages of 15 and 40 are diagnosed with the disease, and the incidence in this age group has doubled in the last 30 years. Many of my friends in their 30s have never had to deal with it on a personal level. I remember when my cousin Elise was undergoing chemotherapy treatment while in her early 30s. When I met her, I couldn't even mention it. Couldn't or wouldn't or didn't say I was sorry or ask how it was going, even though it was so obviously the thing that was going on. I was 35, for God's sakes, a grown-up, a professional, a parent, and cancer was so unthinkable that I couldn't even acknowledge her disease. When my former partner's sister showed up at her house, all bald after her chemotherapy, my remark was, "Hey, you could totally be a lesbian." I was terrified or in denial. More likely, I'd picked up the culture of stigma, and this disabled me from giving genuine acknowledgement. But whatever sympathetic spin you want to give it, I sucked in all the ways that I had to learn how to deal with later. Indeed, an assumption of exceptionalism was only the flip side of my own shame. Fantasies of agency steep both sides of diagnosis. Slide, please. On the provider side, images continually tell us that cancer can be avoided if you eat right, avoid Teflon and smoking, and come from strong stock. Alternatively, tropes of hope, survivorship, battling, and positive attitude are fed to people post-diagnosis as if they were at the helm of some ship of known waters, not along stormy and uncharted shores. And yet, so little of cancer science, patient experience, or survival statistics seems to provide backing for the ubiquitous calls for hope in the popular culture of cancer. After all, who would celebrate the survivor who did not stand amid at least a few poor subs who fell? Everyone who's battled or been touched by or survived or been made into a shadow of a former self has been called to inhabit the myriad cancer cliches and has been asked to live in this caricature. As poets say in rendering their craft, cliches serve to shut down meaning. Cliches allow us not to think about what we are describing or hearing about. We know roses are red. We stop listening. People with cancer are called to live in and through, if recalcitrantly, these hegemonic cliches by news articles, TV shows, detection campaigns, patient pamphlets, high-tech protocol-driven treatments, hospital organizations and smells, and everyday social interactions. Such cultural venues as marches for hope, research funding and direction, pharmaceutical interest, survivor rhetoric, and hospital ads constitute not distinct cultural phenomena, but they overlap to form a broader hegemony of the ways that cancer is talked about, that in turn control and diminish the ways that cancer can be inhabited and spoken about. These non-innocent, restricted languages of cancer exceed the biology of multiplying cells, but the paradox of cancer culture can also be used to reflect on broader American understandings of health and the mismatch of normative assumptions with the ways people actually live and die. For an example of how individuated agency is used in cancer, one might look to the massive literature and movement spurred by Bernard Siegel, which is based on the moral complex of cancer and what he describes as the exceptional patient. In Love, Medicine, and Miracles, Siegel writes about having the right attitude to survive cancer. In Siegel's view and its variants, surviving cancer becomes a moral calling, as if dying were some personal failure. Siegel-style literature offers another form of torture for people with cancer. Did my mind declare war on my body? Am I a cold, repressed person? Okay, don't answer that. This huge and punishing industry preys on fear as much as any in the cancer complex and adds guilt to the mix. One woman with metastatic colon cancer said on a retreat that I attended, "Maybe I haven't laughed enough, but then I look around in the room and some of you laugh a lot more than I do, and you're still here at this retreat." She died a year later, though she'd laughed plenty at the retreat. It's no wonder that shame is such a common response to diagnosis. The dictionary helps with the description here. The painful emotion arising from the consciousness of something dishonoring, ridiculous, or indecorous in one's own conduct or circumstances, or of being in a situation which offends one's sense of modesty or decency. Indeed, cancer does offend. People in treatment are often advised to wear wigs and other disguises, to joke with colleagues. They're given tips on how to make others feel more at ease. One doesn't want to present a decency to seem upbeat. And so do others. A quick, "You look good," with a responsive, "Oh, thanks," offers a welcome segue to the next discussion topic and enables a certain propriety to circumscribe the confusion of proper responses to illness to the stigma embodied by the possibility of a short life and a painful death. One person with metastatic disease calls herself semi-facetiously everyone's worst nightmare. Others speak about how hard it is to see the celebration of survivors while knowing that they themselves are being killed by the disease. Social grace is a good thing, but given the scope of the disease, half of all Americans will die of it and many more will go through treatment, one might wonder what or to whom such an astonishing cultural sight serves. After all, how can cancer, a predictable result of an environment drowning in industrial and military toxicity, be dishonoring or indecorous? I don't mean the side effects. The physical breakdown of the body is perhaps definitive of the word indecorous. And here you just have a map of the nuclear fallout and then the cancer, thyroid cancer rates. But these pre- and post-diagnosis calls to disavowal can help illuminate the ugly underside of Americans' constant will to health, its assumptions about the normativity of health and the social, individual, and generational traumas that it propagates. Expectations and assumptions about lifespan and their discriminatory and generational effects offer but one of the many venues for such an exploration. Another identity or social fact that's come with a good deal of shame and disgust is queerness. So what I'll do today in this short talk is to consider some ways that queer and cancer cultures might speak to each other, might make visible in new ways the paradoxical subject positions of each. Scholars in anthropology and social health have studied how gay and lesbian people are often underserved by medical providers because of negative reactions from healthcare personnel if they disclose their sexual orientation, fear of such responses, and lack of knowledge about research and on specific risk factors. The Center for Disease Control has declared lesbians an underserved group. But I think queer theory can also shed analytic light on how time is understood and sometimes taken for granted in precisely those places where it's most threatened, that is, in illness. Perhaps it's a class issue, but I didn't really think about survival until I was called to consider being in the position of one who might be survived. But diagnosis offers a category invitation that extends to opportunities for retreats, camps, and support groups, to share an infusion room, to do all kinds of things with many people who will not, in fact, survive cancer, and thus to survive them at their memorial services, the garage sales of their things, and in constructing and reading of websites and obituaries. To be sure, cancer survivorship, as opposed to either cancer death or just plain vanilla survival, comes with its benefits. I got a free kayak, albeit with a leak. When things are going really wrong.